It started with a sound, a low, throbbing hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. It had no fixed source, no discernible pattern, yet it persisted, vibrating just below the threshold of what a human ear could fully perceive. At first, people ignored it, attributing the noise to mundane culprits, distant machinery, a blown transformer, or the strange acoustics of the valley where the town of Greywood nestled like a forgotten relic. But then, the dreams began. No one in Greywood could remember precisely when the first report surfaced. Perhaps it was Old Man Grayson, rambling to anyone who'd listen about shimmering eyes watching him through the walls. Or maybe it was little Cassie Hart, waking her parents with blood-curdling screams about the angry silver people. The details were always vague, slippery, as though the memories themselves rebelled against being solidified into words. But the fear was real, and it spread like an invisible contagion. Dr. Elaine Mercer, the town's only psychologist, found herself inundated with patients. Sleep deprivation, panic attacks, sudden fits of violent behavior. Her small, cluttered office became a sanctuary for Greywood's unraveling minds. And yet, no matter how many notes she scribbled or how many pills she prescribed, the underlying cause eluded her. The hum, the dreams, the escalating strangeness that gripped the town like a vice. It wasn't until the night of the blackout that Greywood's descent into madness truly began. The power went out at precisely 10:13 p.m., plunging the town into a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. The hum, however, remained, louder now, more insistent, as though emboldened by the absence of competing noise. Elaine was in her living room, sorting through a week's worth of neglected paperwork, when the lights flickered and died. She muttered a curse under her breath, fumbling for her phone, but even as she reached for it, a strange sensation prickled at the edge of her awareness. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the feeling of being watched, an instinctive, primal unease that tightened her chest and quickened her breath. She turned toward the window, half expecting to see the glow of headlights or the silhouette of a lurking figure. But there was nothing, just the impenetrable darkness of a moonless night. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost tentative, as though whoever, or whatever, was on the other side wasn't entirely sure they wanted to be heard. Elaine froze, her mind racing through a litany of possibilities, none of them comforting. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling despite her efforts to steady it. "Who's there?" No answer. Elaine reached for the fireplace poker, gripping it tightly as she approached the door. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the hum, the knock, even her own shallow breathing. "Dr. Mercer," a voice finally said, and Elaine's blood ran cold. It wasn't the voice of anyone she knew. It wasn't even a voice, not in the traditional sense. It was more like a thought projected directly into her mind, alien and dissonant, each word dripping with a strange, oily resonance. "We require your assistance." Elaine never remembered opening the door. One moment she was standing in her living room, heart hammering in her chest. The next she was outside, staring up at the sky, or what should have been the sky. The stars were gone, swallowed by a swirling void that seemed to pulse and writhe like a living thing. And in the center of that void hung an object. No, a presence, so vast and incomprehensible that Elaine's mind recoiled at the mere attempt to grasp its form. It was like trying to hold on to a dream upon waking, the details slipping through her mental fingers even as she struggled to retain them. She became dimly aware of figures standing around her. Men, women, even children, all wearing the same blank, glassy expression. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the strange light of the void above. "You are chosen," the voice said again, and Elaine realized with a jolt of horror that it wasn't speaking to her alone. It was speaking to all of them. The following weeks were a blur of chaos and confusion. Greywood was effectively cut off from the outside world. Phone lines were dead, roads were inexplicably impassable, and anyone who tried to leave on foot returned hours later, dazed and disoriented, unable to explain why they hadn't made it out. Meanwhile, the hum grew louder, more insistent, invading every corner of the town like a malignant force. People began acting strangely. Neighbors who had known each other for decades suddenly becoming hostile, violent, or eerily compliant. Elaine watched in mounting horror as Greywood descended into a surreal nightmare, its residents transforming into something less than human. And always, there were the disappearances. First, it was just a handful of people, those who had been most affected by the dreams, the hum. But as the days stretched into weeks, more and more residents vanished without a trace. Their homes were left eerily undisturbed, as though they had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. Elaine tried to make sense of it all, poring over her notes, searching for patterns, connections, anything that might explain what was happening. But the more she dug, the more she felt as though she were unraveling herself. The lines between reality and hallucination blurred, and she began to see things, shapes in the shadows, figures lurking at the edge of her vision, their faces just out of focus. And then, one night, she found herself standing outside the old textile mill on the edge of town, drawn there by a compulsion she couldn't explain. The mill had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered, its walls crumbling with neglect. But tonight, it was alive with light, an unnatural, pulsating glow that spilled out into the darkness like liquid fire. Elaine stepped inside, her breath hitching as she took in the scene before her. The townspeople were gathered in the center of the mill, their bodies swaying in unison, their faces upturned toward the light. And in the middle of them stood something that defied all reason, an amorphous, shifting mass of flesh and light, its surface rippling with faces that seemed to scream silently before dissolving back into the hole. "You have been prepared," the voice intoned, and Elaine realized with a sickening lurch that it was coming from the thing in the center of the room. "You will become more." Elaine's first instinct was to run, but her body betrayed her. Her feet remained planted on the cracked concrete floor of the mill as if held in place by invisible roots. The glow from the pulsating mass intensified, casting strange, angular shadows across the room. The faces embedded in its surface twisted and contorted, mouths silently shaping words that no sound accompanied. "You have been prepared," the voice repeated, sinking deeper into her mind. Each syllable felt like a scalpel scraping against her thoughts, carving into the bedrock of her identity. Elaine realized she wasn't alone in her horror. Among the swaying townsfolk, a few others shared her lucid terror, their wide, darting eyes betraying an understanding of just how wrong all of this was. One of them, a man she recognized as Greg Sumner, the town's postmaster, caught her gaze. His lips moved, whispering words she couldn't hear over the oppressive hum. He mouthed, "Don't look." But how could she not? The mass demanded attention. It was impossible to tear her eyes away from its grotesque beauty, the ever-shifting tableau of faces and limbs that emerged and receded in an endless, grotesque rhythm. It seemed to pulse in time with the hum that had haunted the town, and Elaine felt as though her own heartbeat was being forcibly synchronized with its rhythm. And then, with a wet, sucking sound, the mass began to change. The faces began to merge, their features stretching and smearing into new forms. Hands reached out from the entity, too many fingers, too many joints, and brushed against the air like blind spiders seeking prey. One hand grew larger, elongating unnaturally, and reached down into the crowd. The swaying townsfolk welcomed it, raising their hands as if in reverence. Elaine wanted to scream, but the sound died in her throat. The hand plucked a woman from the crowd, Mrs. Lutz, the kindly owner of the bakery. Her expression remained eerily neutral as the hand hoisted her into the air and pulled her toward the pulsating core. Her body didn't so much enter the mass as dissolve into it, her form breaking apart like wet clay and merging seamlessly with the shifting flesh. Elaine gagged, bile rising in her throat, but she couldn't look away. She glanced at Greg again, who was now backing toward the mill's broken side door. His eyes darted between her and the townsfolk, silently urging her to follow. A sudden spike in the hum rattled her skull. The voice returned, more insistent now, pressing into her consciousness with the weight of a tidal wave. You are chosen. Do not resist. Resistance is irrelevant. Greg reached the door, his movements slow and deliberate, as if fighting an invisible current. Elaine forced herself to move, one agonizing step at a time, her legs trembling under the effort. She felt as though she were walking through molasses. Every step met with resistance that wasn't physical, but deeply psychological, as though her own mind was conspiring to keep her in place. The hand was moving again, reaching down into the crowd for its next victim. This time it grasped a young boy, Sammy Corrigan, no older than 8. Elaine's heart broke as his small form was lifted into the air, his face still slack and unseeing. The hand brought him closer to the mass, and for a moment, Elaine thought she saw his eyes flicker with awareness, his mouth opening in a silent scream. She couldn't stay. She had to move. Greg was halfway out the door now, gesturing frantically for her to follow. The hum grew louder, more insistent, as though the entity was aware of her intent to flee. Elaine forced her legs to move faster, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Her hand brushed against the cold metal of the doorframe, just as the voice thundered in her mind. You cannot leave. You belong. But she did. The cold night air hit her like a slap to the face, and for a moment, she staggered, her knees buckling under the weight of what she had just seen. Greg grabbed her arm, pulling her upright, and the two of them stumbled away from the mill. The glow from the windows lit up the surrounding trees, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. We don't have much time, Greg hissed, his voice low and urgent. They'll know we're gone. They always know. Well, what the hell is that thing? Elaine stammered, her voice barely more than a whisper. Greg shook his head. I don't know. No one does. It's been here for months, maybe longer. The dreams, the hum, it's all connected to that. He glanced over his shoulder, his face pale and haunted. But it's not just here. It's spreading. Elaine felt a chill crawl down her spine. Spreading? To where? Everywhere, Greg said grimly. Greywood is just the start. It's using us, turning us into whatever the hell those people in there are. But it won't stop here. It's growing, feeding. If we don't stop it. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The two of them moved through the woods, the trees closing in around them like skeletal sentinels. The hum followed them, faint but persistent, burrowing into their minds like a parasite. Elaine's thoughts felt sluggish, her memories fragmented and disjointed. She clung to the one thing she could still hold on to, the need to survive. Where are we going? She asked, her voice trembling. There's an old shelter, Greg said, built back in the Cold War. It's off the grid, no power, no signal. They can't reach us there. At least I don't think they can. The uncertainty in his voice did little to reassure her, but she followed anyway. What choice did she have? As they pressed deeper into the woods, the hum grew quieter, fading into the background like a distant storm. But the silence that replaced it was no less unsettling. The trees seemed to loom closer, their gnarled branches twisting into shapes that Elaine's exhausted mind kept trying to interpret as faces. And then, without warning, Greg stopped. Do you see that? He whispered, pointing ahead. Elaine squinted into the darkness. At first, she saw nothing, just the tangled underbrush and the faint outlines of trees. But then she saw it, a faint, flickering light, hovering just above the ground. It was small, no larger than a firefly, but it pulsed with a rhythm that felt disturbingly familiar. The hum returned, so faint it was almost imperceptible. It's one of them, Greg said, his voice barely audible. A scout. Elaine's breath caught in her throat. The light began to move, weaving through the trees with an unnatural grace, heading straight toward them. Run, Greg whispered. And they did. Elaine and Greg sprinted through the woods, the flickering light pursuing them like a malevolent wisp. It moved unnaturally, its darting motions defying any laws of physics she understood. One moment it was far behind them. The next, it was a hair's breadth away, bathing the trees in an eerie, otherworldly glow. Branches clawed at Elaine's arms and legs as she ran, but she didn't dare slow down. Her lungs burned. Her muscles screamed for relief. But the primal need to escape overpowered everything else. "Over here!" Greg hissed, veering suddenly to the right. Elaine followed, nearly tripping over a fallen branch in the process. The faint outline of a structure emerged ahead, a squat, concrete bunker partially obscured by undergrowth. Greg reached it first, fumbling with a rusted metal door that groaned in protest as he wrenched it open. "Get inside," he barked. Elaine dove through the opening just as the flickering light reached the clearing. Greg slammed the door shut, plunging them into darkness. For a moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing. Then came the hum, louder now, resonating through the walls of the bunker like a living thing. "What is it doing?" Elaine whispered, her voice trembling. Greg pressed his ear to the door, his face taut with concentration. "I don't know. They usually don't follow this far. It's like it's trying to figure us out." The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and then abruptly it stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. Elaine strained to hear any sign of movement outside, but there was nothing. Just the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Did it leave?" she asked. Greg didn't answer. He was staring at the door, his expression unreadable. "Greg!" Slowly, he turned to face her. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, and for one horrifying moment, she thought he might be one of them. But then he blinked, and the spell was broken. "They're not going to stop," he said quietly. "Not until they have all of us." The bunker was small and claustrophobic, with walls stained by decades of damp and neglect. A single lantern sat on a rickety metal table, its weak yellow light casting long shadows across the room. Elaine slumped into a chair, her body shaking with exhaustion. "What did you mean, spreading?" she asked after a long silence. Greg hesitated, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I've seen it before. Not this exact thing, but something like it." Elaine frowned. "What are you talking about?" Greg leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You ever hear about the Sutterville incident?" Elaine shook her head. "Of course you haven't," Greg said bitterly. "They covered it up. Hell, they probably scrubbed it from every record they could find. But I was there. I saw what happened." He paused, his eyes distant, as though he were reliving a memory he'd tried desperately to bury. "It started the same way. A hum. Dreams. People disappearing. At first, everyone thought it was just some kind of mass hysteria, but then the changes started. People weren't just disappearing. They were becoming something else. They stopped being human. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was too late." "What happened to the town?" Elaine asked, her voice barely audible. Greg met her gaze, his expression haunted. "They burned it to the ground." Before Elaine could respond, a faint tapping sound echoed through the bunker. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. Greg shot to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun holstered at his hip. "It's them," he muttered, his voice tight with fear. Elaine's heart raced as the tapping turned into a rhythmic pounding, like 1,000 fists hammering against the walls. The hum returned, seeping through the cracks in the concrete, filling the air with its suffocating presence. "They can't get in, right?" she asked, her voice trembling. Greg didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the table and began rummaging through a duffel bag, pulling out a shotgun and a handful of shells. "Greg, they're not going to stop," he said again, his hands shaking as he loaded the weapon. "We have to fight." Elaine felt a surge of anger. "Fight? Fight what, Greg? We don't even know what the hell these things are." "I know enough," Greg snapped. "I know they're not invincible. I saw one of them die back in Sutterville. It didn't just disappear, it died. That means they can all die." As if in response, the pounding on the walls intensified. A hairline crack appeared in the ceiling, sending a shower of dust raining down on them. "They're coming through," Greg muttered. "Get ready." Elaine wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything other than sit there and wait for whatever was outside to breach the bunker. But something inside her, some primal survival instinct, kicked in, and she grabbed a rusted crowbar from the floor, gripping it tightly in her hands. The first breach came on the far wall, a fist-sized hole that appeared as though the concrete had simply melted away. Through it, She could see the faint glow of the flickering light. And then the voices started. They weren't words, not exactly, but a series of overlapping sounds that seemed to bypass her ears and speak directly to her mind. They were alien and incomprehensible, yet somehow deeply familiar, like echoes of forgotten memories. Elaine pressed her hands to her ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. "Don't listen to them," Greg shouted, firing a shot into the hole. The glow flickered and disappeared, but the voices persisted, growing louder and more insistent. The walls of the bunker began to ripple, the concrete warping and twisting as though it were alive. And then, with a deafening roar, the door burst open. The thing that entered the bunker was not the light. It was worse. Its form defied logic, a constantly shifting mass of flesh and metal and light that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. Faces emerged from its surface, screaming silently before dissolving back into the chaos. Elaine froze, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. Greg fired again and again, but the bullets passed through the thing as though it weren't really there. And then it turned its attention to her. Elaine couldn't move. The thing's attention was like a physical weight, pinning her to the spot. It wasn't just looking at her. It was invading her, peeling back the layers of her mind with a surgical precision that was almost tender. Memories she hadn't thought about in years spilled out in a chaotic flood. Her first bicycle, her mother's laugh, the bitter cold of her father's funeral. "You are incomplete," the voice said, and it wasn't the same dissonant tone that had plagued her before. This one was softer, more intimate, laced with a strange pity. Behind her, Greg screamed, and Elaine's paralysis broke. She turned just in time to see him lifted off the ground by one of the thing's appendages, a tendril of light and shadow that wrapped around his torso like a living noose. His shotgun clattered to the floor as he clawed uselessly at the tendril, his face contorted in agony. "Let him go!" Elaine shouted, surging to her feet. She swung the crowbar with all her strength, the metal colliding with the thing's surface. The impact sent a shockwave through her arms, but it didn't seem to do any damage. Instead, the thing shifted, its surface rippling like disturbed water. "Violence is futile," it intoned. "We seek only union." "Union?" Elaine spat. "Is that what you call this? Turning us into things like you?" The tendril holding Greg tightened, and his screams cut off abruptly. For a terrifying moment, Elaine thought he was dead, but then the thing released him, letting his limp body crumple to the floor. "You misunderstand," the voice said, and the thing began to change. Its shifting mass coalesced into something vaguely humanoid, a tall, slender figure with impossibly long limbs and a featureless face. It extended a hand toward her, the gesture almost gentle. "We do not take. We give." Elaine backed away, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Give what?" "Completion." Greg groaned from the floor, his face pale and slick with sweat. Elaine dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her fingers to his neck. His pulse was weak but steady. "We have to get out of here," she whispered. Greg's eyes fluttered open, and he stared at her with a mix of terror and resignation. "You can't run," he rasped. "It doesn't stop. It never stops." The thing tilted its head, as though considering his words. "Resistance is a symptom of fear," it said. "Fear of the inevitable. But there is no need to fear. The path is already set." Elaine's grip on the crowbar tightened. "The only thing inevitable is that I'm not letting you turn us into one of your puppets." The thing's featureless face seemed to ripple, as though it were trying to smile. "Puppet, a limited concept. We do not control. We liberate." "Liberate?" Elaine let out a bitter laugh. "You're turning people into monsters. You're tearing them apart." The thing took a step closer, and Elaine instinctively raised the crowbar, holding it between them like a talisman. "What you call tearing apart is merely the shedding of limitations," it said. "Your kind is bound by constraints, fear, mortality, isolation. We offer freedom, unity." "I don't want your unity," Elaine shouted. The thing paused, its head tilting again. For a moment, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls and floor of the bunker, and then it spoke again. Desire is irrelevant. The process has already begun. Elaine's body tensed as the thing extended another tendril, its glowing surface undulating with strange patterns. She swung the crowbar again, but this time the thing didn't even flinch. The tendril wrapped around her wrist, the touch cold and electric, and a wave of images flooded her mind. She saw herself standing in a vast, featureless void, her body dissolving into light. She felt the presence of countless others, billions, maybe more, all connected in a way that defied comprehension. It was overwhelming, suffocating, yet also strangely comforting, as though she were a single note in a grand, infinite symphony. "Elaine!" Greg's voice cut through the vision, grounding her in the present. She jerked her arm free, the tendril retreating with an almost disappointed flicker. "We have to move," Greg said, his voice hoarse but urgent. "Now!" Elaine nodded, helping him to his feet. Together, they stumbled toward the back of the bunker, where a narrow passageway led to a secondary exit. The thing didn't follow immediately, but its voice echoed in her mind, louder and more insistent. "You cannot escape what you are meant to become." The passage was cramped and stifling, the air thick with the scent of mildew and rust. Elaine half-dragged Greg through the tunnel, her ears straining for any sign of pursuit. The hum was distant now, but she could still feel it, a subtle vibration in her bones, a constant reminder that the thing was never far away. "Do you have a plan?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. Greg let out a humorless laugh. "If I did, do you think we'd be in this mess?" Elaine bit back a retort, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other. The tunnel eventually opened into a small clearing on the edge of the woods. Moonlight spilled through the trees, and for a moment, Elaine felt a flicker of hope. But then she saw them. Dozens of flickering lights hovered at the edge of the clearing, their movements slow and deliberate. They didn't approach, but their presence was unmistakable, a wall of alien intent blocking any chance of escape. Greg swore under his breath, raising the shotgun again. "We're surrounded." Elaine's grip on the crowbar tightened as she scanned the clearing for any possible escape route. "What do we do?" Greg's jaw tightened. "We fight." The lights surged forward. The lights surged toward them, a wave of flickering, living energy that danced and writhed like a storm made flesh. Elaine braced herself, the crowbar raised, though she knew deep down that it was futile. These things weren't of this world, weren't of any world she could comprehend. What chance did a rusted piece of metal and a worn-out shotgun have against such a force? "Hold your ground," Greg barked, his voice cracking as he leveled the shotgun. He fired, the blast tearing through the night and illuminating the scene in a brief flash of orange light. The shot didn't stop the lights. It didn't even slow them down. The glowing forms parted around the spread of buckshot like water around a stone, reforming almost instantly as they pressed closer. "Greg!" Elaine shouted, grabbing his arm. "We can't fight them. We don't have a choice," he snapped, pumping the shotgun for another shot. But before he could pull the trigger, one of the lights reached him. It wasn't violent, at least not in the traditional sense. The light wrapped around his torso, flowing over him like liquid mercury. Greg froze, his expression twisting from anger to terror as the light seeped into his skin. "Greg!" Elaine screamed, reaching for him, but another light surged between them, forcing her back. She swung the crowbar wildly, but it passed through the glowing form without resistance. Greg fell to his knees, his body convulsing as the light consumed him. His eyes rolled back in his head, his mouth opening in a silent scream. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The light withdrew, leaving Greg slumped on the ground, motionless. Elaine's breath hitched as she stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Greg," she whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. He moved. It was subtle at first, a twitch of his fingers, a shallow intake of breath. But then he lifted his head. His eyes met hers, and Elaine felt a jolt of pure dread. His eyes were no longer human. They glowed faintly, reflecting the same flickering light that had consumed him. "Elaine," he said, his voice calm, almost serene. She stepped back, shaking her head. No, this isn't happening." You don't understand, Greg said, rising slowly to his feet. It's not what we thought. It's not an invasion. It's a gift. Elaine felt a cold shiver run down her spine. What are you talking about? Greg, they did something to you. They showed me the truth, he said, his glowing eyes fixing on her with an intensity that made her stomach churn. We've been blind, Elaine. Blind to what we are, to what we can be. But they can fix us. They can make us whole. Stay away from me, she warned, raising the crowbar again. Greg took a step toward her, his expression softening. You don't have to be afraid. Once you let them in, you'll understand. It's beautiful. Elaine's grip on the crowbar tightened. I don't want to understand. I just want this to stop. Greg smiled, a slow, unnatural smile that didn't reach his glowing eyes. It's not about what you want. It's about what you are. And what you are is chosen. The lights began to close in, their movements deliberate, unhurried, as though they knew there was no need to rush. Elaine's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear and desperation. She couldn't fight them. She couldn't outrun them. But maybe her eyes darted to the edge of the clearing, where the trees were thickest. If she could just make it past the lights, get back into the woods, maybe she could find somewhere to hide. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all she had. Without another word, she turned and ran. The lights reacted instantly, surging toward her like a swarm of angry wasps. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the air and rattling her teeth. Elaine pushed herself harder, ignoring the burning in her legs, the stabbing pain in her side. She had to keep moving. She had to. The ground disappeared beneath her feet. Elaine tumbled forward, her body slamming into the rocky earth as she fell into a shallow ravine. Pain flared in her shoulder, but she ignored it, scrambling to her feet just as the first of the lights reached the edge of the ravine. They hovered there, hesitating for the first time. Elaine didn't know why, and she didn't care. She turned and ran deeper into the ravine, the uneven terrain slowing her pace, but providing some semblance of cover. The hum followed her, quieter now, but still persistent, like a distant heartbeat. After what felt like hours, Elaine stumbled into a narrow cave at the base of the ravine. The entrance was small, barely wide enough for her to squeeze through, but it opened into a larger chamber that offered a momentary reprieve from the oppressive glow of the lights. She collapsed against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Her hands were shaking, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. For the first time since the nightmare began, she allowed herself to cry. But her relief was short-lived. A faint flicker of light appeared at the cave entrance, followed by another and another. They had found her. Elaine scrambled to her feet, gripping the crowbar with hands slick with sweat. "Leave me alone," she shouted, her voice echoing off the cave walls. The lights didn't respond. They hovered in the entrance, their glow filling the chamber with an eerie, otherworldly radiance. And then, one by one, they began to move toward her. Elaine swung the crowbar wildly, but it was like fighting smoke. The lights circled her, their movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring her fear. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please, just let me go." The voice returned, softer now, almost soothing. "You are chosen." The lights closed in. The lights converged, wrapping Elaine in a cocoon of brilliance. She fought instinctively, flailing with the crowbar, screaming until her voice was hoarse, but the resistance felt like a hollow gesture. The glow wasn't just around her, it was inside her. It seeped into her skin, into her bones, into the places of her mind she had never dared to examine. "You are chosen," the voice repeated, each word accompanied by a pulse of warmth and cold, pain and ecstasy. Elaine felt her memories unraveling, spilling out of her like threads pulled from an ancient tapestry. Faces, places, moments she had long since forgotten drifted past her consciousness like leaves on a river. She saw her mother's face, lined with worry as she held a young, feverish Elaine in her arms. She saw the first man she'd ever loved, his smile bright and careless, his betrayal cutting deeper than any wound. She saw herself standing alone in her office, night after night, drowning in the pain of others while ignoring her own. You are more than what you were, the voice said, gentle now, coaxing. You are more than what you feared. The light grew brighter, more intense, until it consumed everything. Elaine woke to silence. She was lying on her back, staring up at an endless expanse of white sky. It wasn't the sterile white of a hospital ceiling or the harsh white of a fluorescent bulb. It was soft, luminous, alive. Slowly, she sat up. She was in a field of impossibly tall grass that shimmered with iridescent colors. The air was warm and thick, carrying a scent that reminded her of fresh rain and blooming flowers. In the distance, she could see figures moving, tall, elegant shapes that radiated light. Her heart pounded as she remembered the lights, the hum, the thing that had consumed her. But when she looked down at herself, she saw no wounds, no scars. Her skin was smooth, untouched, glowing faintly with the same iridescent sheen as the grass. You're awake. Elaine turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. Greg was standing a few feet away, his eyes still glowing faintly, his posture relaxed. What happened? She asked, her voice trembling. Greg smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, it wasn't unsettling. It was kind. They completed us, he said simply. Elaine shook her head, backing away. No, they took us. They showed us what we could be, Greg interrupted, stepping closer. They showed us the truth. Don't you feel it, Elaine? Don't you see it? She wanted to deny it, to cling to her fear and anger, but something in his words resonated with a part of her she couldn't ignore. She glanced down at her hands, watching as faint tendrils of light danced across her skin. She felt stronger, sharper, more alive than she had ever been. What am I? She whispered. Greg placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and steady. You're what you were always meant to be, part of something greater. The figures in the distance began to move closer, their forms becoming clearer as they approached. They were tall and humanoid, but their features were fluid, constantly shifting in a way that defied logic. Elaine tensed, but Greg's hand on her shoulder reassured her. They won't hurt you, he said. They're us, or at least what we're becoming. As the figures drew nearer, Elaine felt a strange sense of recognition, as though she were looking at old friends she had forgotten. One of them reached out, its hand shimmering with light, and Elaine felt an overwhelming sense of peace as its fingers brushed against hers. Images flooded her mind, not memories but possibilities. She saw cities of light, sprawling across alien landscapes. She saw herself standing among countless others, their voices harmonizing into a song that resonated across the stars. She saw an endless cycle of creation and renewal, a tapestry of life that stretched beyond time. It was terrifying. It was beautiful. Elaine and Greg stood side by side, watching as the landscape shifted around them, the grass dissolving into a sea of light. What happens now? She asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning within her. Greg smiled again, his expression serene. We move forward, together. Elaine looked out at the figures, at the light, at the vast expanse of possibility before her. She thought about the life she had left behind, the pain, the loneliness, the constant struggle to hold herself together. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she let it go. She stepped forward into the light, and the hum followed, not as a threat, but as a song. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning.